having me. I'm going to just share my presentation, the screen. Let me know when you can see it.
We absolutely can.
Okay, fantastic. We've had some fantastic speakers already. I think from Honorable DG and Madame Kalondo and now Jessica, all touching on very salient matters that we need to consider as communicators within a sphere of pandemics and epidemics on our continent. I think, colleagues, what I'm going to touch on today is slightly different, related obviously in the sense because we are communicating, but I wanted to look at an integrated approach to communicating during a pandemic, and perhaps that could give us some sort of a sense of how best we can conduct our communication so that it's impactful to the publics that we serve as media. So please let me know when you can see. Okay, great. So essentially, I'm going to just touch on the changing environment, which I think most of us are aware of, and then talk about what this integrated communications approach is like, and then I'll dissect that into the various phases. And I'd like to maybe make some comparisons or take examples from how we have managed the HIV versus the COVID-19 pandemic before I then conclude. So initially, I think it's fair to say that the landscape in which we operate as practitioners, media houses, communicators within the continent is fast changing. And the availability of media content essentially is actually spurring and driving this particular change. And more so, Jessica just touched on the languages in the DR Congo at the moment. Much of the content that's actually being generated is in languages other than English. So during a pandemic or an epidemic, in fact, epidemics first, of course, then a pandemic, such as the HIV pandemic that we saw, and more recently the COVID-19, there's always a rise, and certainly we are seeing it now in a dangerous rise in infodemic, because essentially misinformation has become more prolific. Over and above that, we then get fake news that gets fueled specifically because social media platforms tend to favor click-worthy platforms, even if they are not necessarily accurate. So it makes the environment quite challenging for practitioners, media practitioners, communicators, as well as journalists in general, in assuring public of correct and reliable information. Then, of course, we have the impact of behavior on society that pandemics present, and the prolific information actually is a consequence of that. It causes a lot of panic, and people have to change behavior in order to safeguard themselves. However, the confusion in which information is correct and incorrect often delays that process. And then, of course, I think across the African continent, we have experienced that the public don't necessarily always trust information that is coming from the media, partially because there's a perception that some of the media houses or media are closely aligned to government, and sometimes there's a trust deficit there, which I think Madame Kalondo touched on earlier. For example, in Nigeria at the moment, it took a while for a lot of the people to believe that the pandemic was in effect affecting the population, because when they watched national television stations that are predominantly governed by the state, they felt that they cannot trust that information. It was only when they started to see some politicians dying that they thought, oh, maybe there is something to this pandemic. So effectively, the environment for journalists, for media is really complex. And I think that in a pandemic setup, there's a real need for media to work very closely with authorities, the government, in order to ensure that information that's disseminated to the public is actually factual and correct. In addressing an integrated approach to communication, as I think, first of all, I think all of us are consumers of media content, and so we need to appreciate that if we're actually communicating with the view of actually changing lives or having an impact in society, or in fact ensuring that behavior is changed such that people's lives are safeguarded, people are well informed, then we need to understand that you can't just inform people about what is actually happening. There's a lot more that we need to do as media. So, of course, the first phase talks to addressing what is actually happening. Madam Kalondo alluded to the fact that we need simplicity, and Jessica also in her presentation, you need to be simple, you need to be factual and deliver the information timelessly. Over and above that, you need to look at the educational component and multi-channel approach to educating the public about pandemics and what is actually transpiring, how to protect themselves, and maybe some of the ills that actually emerge from those epidemics, how they must manage them in their lives. And in order to do that most effectively as media, we need the third phase, which is actually collaboration and partnerships. And many of the speakers have already touched on that before. As media, we know that we are most effective when we are in collaborations and partnerships, either with other social agents, government, civil society, the corporate, etc., NGOs, and the like. So if we have a look at the first phase of media's role in this kind of environment, we understand that our role really is to ensure that the public are well informed, and we actually continue to defend their right to know. So often we have to put ourselves at risk as journalists to actually deliver the information to the public, because the public expect it of us. They expect us to be in the line of fire, and wherever the news is breaking, we need to be there. Otherwise, we lose credibility. We are expected to provide information that is factual about epidemics and pandemics. We are expected to transmit it in all platforms that are possibly available, and it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be quick. And then also something that also was touched on by previous speakers is that we are expected to be empathetic and really to cover information in a sensitive manner. Now, media is often first to know information, and because obviously they are reliant on the authorities that are the owners of that information to disseminate that information to them timelessly. But media in Africa has also faced a lot of challenges in delivering information on time, largely because of the proliferation of communication as a consequence of internet, and as mentioned earlier, the misinformation. I was reading an article just last week on a study that was conducted by the Bruno Kelser Foundation in partnership with UNESCO. And they found that for coronavirus, 42% of the information that was shared on social media, especially platforms like Twitter, was actually incorrect. That is a lot of information, and effectively, you've got the effect of special interest groups there. You've got bots that are generating information, and so it becomes very difficult for the public to actually disseminate, or to be able to decipher what is true and what is not. So the credibility of media houses and media platforms is really quite important in actually assisting the public to safeguard themselves in a pandemic. And then, of course, I think that an association also with certain governments or government views is rather dangerous in ensuring that media is trusted by its public, which is what I've just highlighted an example in Nigeria. That is what is happening, and across the continent and globally, in fact. An example, though, of good practice where we've seen some of the media activities that have actually led to information being shared timelessly and people knowing exactly what to do as a consequence is when the first case of COVID-19 was reported in South Africa, where SABC actually streamed that information, and the ministers' briefings were streamed live, but also created a map on the website of all the hospitals that the public could go and access for testing and the like. That was available immediately. So it certainly assisted people to know where to go to receive some support or help. Of course, that's not enough. We all know that, you know, that's just the first stage. That's the first phase. And you can see that that first phase perhaps saves some people. Some people get ill, but can then get some support. But effectively, it's not enough because many people can still die because it takes a while for people to change their behavior, to change their or in fact to even understand or have the information sink in. So you need another level of reinforcement, of resharing, and really assisting the people to understand what the impact of a pandemic or an epidemic is to their lives. This is where the education component comes in. Effectively, we have a major role in educating the public, not only because that we are perceived as the first point of information sourcing by the public, but because effectively there has been so much distrust by African publics with their governments and over time. So it really does matter to really educate the public even further. So during pandemics, typically African houses are expected to create more content around pandemics, and not only maybe to educate, but to really get people to understand the impact of those pandemics to their lives, to their livelihoods, to their ability to move, their ability to travel, to educate themselves, to go to school, etc., to be able to continue to live their lives as they have. So there is an expectation that new channels are created to create more access to education, as well as existing channels are enhanced with additional content that speaks directly to the pandemic or the epidemic, as is the case, as was the case with HIV across the continent, and right now with COVID-19. We're starting to see a lot of education programs targeted at readers, at listeners, at viewers, that specifically talk to how the public can protect themselves and measures that they can take to safeguard their livelihoods during pandemics. Across the African media landscape, we've also seen dedicated slots created on primetime television, digital platforms for educational content that speaks directly to COVID-19 in and around magazine programs, dramas that exist, soapies that exist. We've seen storylines changing that actually incorporate pandemics and what they're all about, also as a form of education, and children's programs being targeted to ensure that children understand what the various epidemics are and can also look after themselves. Over and above that, I think that media has a major role in actually not just pandemic or epidemic related content, but really content that actually assists during a pandemic in the ills that actually emerge as a consequence. So for example, we've seen quite a number of schooling programs that have gone not only digitally, but also radio and television platforms that have actually supported governments in ensuring that the curriculum for learners continues to be accessible, particularly because many of our learners don't necessarily have access to to data or internet, especially in the remote areas. So media has actually played a major role in actually becoming the classroom to ensure that learners can still continue to further their studies. Social media in particular has played a major role, and while I touched on the fact that social media has had its woes in our society in particular, it has also played a very important role in ensuring that we've got access to education during an epidemic. The advancing technology is also going to be playing a major role for us as the media practitioners in ensuring that we can assist educational initiatives far more than what we have done in the past, particularly for print media who have had to be forced under the current circumstances to review, and many of them have had to close down because, of course, the pandemic has put additional pressures to an already very difficult environment. But over and above that, I think that many of them have also had to look at how technology and the digital era must play a more central role in ensuring their survival, but also in their relevance in contributing to the education of the public. So with that second phase, we obviously see a response, or rather an impact to our communities and to our publics, that amplified educational content does tend to have a significant impact in terms of how people are responsive to an epidemic and a pandemic. Finally, the third phase really talks to, really is what our role is as social agents, as the media. We really exist to ensure that we have an impact in society, that not only do we educate, not only do we inform, but we actually make a significant impact in changing lives of our society. And we can only do that by really partnering with other social change agents to ensure that our communities are best looked after during an epidemic. And of course, through the various platforms that we've got, whether it's TV, radio, print media, streaming, social, etc., we really have a major role in playing a change agent in our communities throughout the continent. Many media houses have had successful partnerships over epidemics and pandemics. I know that Ms. Jessica touched on some of those in her delivery. And these are really crucial, and that has to be part of the three-phase approach to us being more effective in terms of communicating. For example, one of the programs that stands out during the height of HIV infection in South Africa was Love Life, which was actually a program that was recognized by WHO for its effective impact on not only the awareness, but change impact that it had, particularly on young people in South Africa during the height of infection of HIV. Media also has played a major role in the recent COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa, where during the Easter break, all society were all under lockdown. So no one could attend their services, their church services during Easter. And of course, being a very Christian country, we are very, very reliant on our services and masses during this period. And media, in partnership with government and faith denominations, played a crucial role in ensuring that society is still able to celebrate their religious holidays and commemorate Easter, which is quite central to a Christian country like ourselves. So effectively, media's partnerships have played a role in a number of areas, particularly also in the surge of gender-based violence, and you'll see in the slides to come how media has particularly played a role in some of the ills that have actually emerged as a consequence of epidemics across the continent. And of course, with that third phase, the hope is that that integration of an information approach, an educational approach, as well as changing the lives of individuals in society will culminate into ensuring that we are seeing fewer people affected by epidemics on the continent, and more people actually learning what the epidemics are about in time to be able to protect themselves and not only their health, but also livelihoods. So just very briefly, I wanted to touch on the HIV versus coronavirus response by the media. And the reason for this slide is actually to give you a context in terms of how the HIV pandemic, well, it's no longer a pandemic, but how as a pandemic it compared in size to coronavirus and what the response from the media has been like. So if I have a look at right at we start at the bottom, how the actual media actually played a role in breaking the news on the HIV versus the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly here in South Africa, there were a number of issues because, of course, we had debates about whether or not HIV actually caused AIDS, and the delay in finalizing that particular argument actually caused a lot of unnecessary deaths, and there was a lot of misalignment between what was being said versus what the scientists were saying. So that actually was the focus for the media in the beginning of the infection in this particular country. Whereas either maybe because of the fact that there was a delayed infection here in Africa, we started to see what was happening in China, then in Europe, particularly countries like Italy. So by the time that we had our first case in Egypt, we had already seen what was going on globally. We also, because of social media being instant, everybody knows what's going on. I think we were better prepared to really cover the information effectively as media from the onset. Then, of course, we played a role in some of the social ills that emerged as a consequence of these pandemics and epidemics. From a xenophobic perspective, we know that initially there was a lot of prejudice against gay communities and people that were drug users at the time, especially because of needles, and media played a major role in highlighting the plight of those that were marginalized as a consequence of being positive. In the same light, media has played a crucial role, particularly in certain countries. Maybe not so much on our continent, but certainly there has been some prejudice against people of Asian descent in terms of whether or not they might be carrying the virus, etc., especially in the initial stages of the virus's development. And of course, from a border restriction, in both instances, we saw media playing a role in highlighting movement restrictions. First of all, I think certainly in places like the USA, there were lots of restrictions around people who were positive, and many other countries across the globe. And then, of course, from a COVID-19 perspective, because we've had to be based predominantly in the homes, mobility has been limited. Media also played a role in highlighting that. I won't go into the rest of the detail. I would like to share the presentation with you, but I think most significant for us really is the role that media has played in the gender-based violence fight. And I mentioned earlier that, for example, both with HIV and COVID-19, we've had severe issues of gender-based violence. Initially with HIV, media highlighted the fact that it highlighted some of the myths that were existing in society. For example, in South Africa, where people believed that sleeping with a virgin will actually cure your HIV status, and so that actually saw a rise in in gender-based or yeah, predominantly gender-based violence activity. And we see it now with COVID-19, where people are confined to small spaces with their abusers, and that certainly has exacerbated that situation. Now, very briefly, before I conclude, just a sense of what a broadcaster, one of the largest broadcaster on the continent, as in SABC, has done in both instances in terms of really trying to go beyond the news component. And of course, we know that our news wing is very, very strong. It certainly has been ranked as one of the most trusted news agencies in the country, and also is ranked one of the #1 service providers of relevant news in the country. So there's no doubt that there's significant trust in our news agency. However, over and above the news agency, whose major role is really to inform, the broadcaster has done a lot in terms of content development and partnerships to ensure that the public is always informed and and also decreases stereotype around people that are infected by the various viruses. So in the case of HIV, we've done a lot of extensive work that continues to be the case, because of course HIV is not gone, much to everybody's surprise maybe, because I was just looking at stats the other day. We've had 50,000 deaths between 1st of January and end of May in South Africa that are HIV related, and at the time we had 230 deaths of COVID-19. So very much HIV is still very much an issue, but it's managed and it's definitely no longer a pandemic. It's a disease that is very manageable right now. But in the period, we have had a number of award-winning series, children's programs, factual dramas, and extensive radio programming, award-winning radio programs that were funded by the Johns Hopkins University, intersections that won awards across the board, that were both on radio and television. And of course, we've had a similar response in terms of COVID-19 with children's programs, factual content, radio programs, as well as digital. In fact, one of the things that I think that we need to pride ourselves as a broadcaster are our initiatives around supporting education in this time, because many of our learners don't have access to internet or computers, and so they've had to rely on content from television and radio to ensure that their curriculum is completed for the year and they don't fall behind. So in conclusion, essentially, I think that one of the things I wanted to highlight with this presentation is that our approach has got to be multidimensional. It's got to be not only information focused, it's got to be education focused. We need to invest in that, and also look at how partnerships can play a role in ensuring that we are most effective as media in communicating during an epidemic or pandemic. So in conclusion, really there are many opportunities for us to be better communicators during pandemics on the continent. However, that does really require for us to be better resourced as media. We also need to have credibility and editorial independence within the view within the perceptions of the public. And we also need to embrace technology and understand that technology plays a major role for us in doing our job more effectively. But also the fact that, we must prioritize our own safety. Many times we talk about media in reporting, in bringing education to the people, but we also need to resource ourselves well to be able to safeguard our own health, because we are most at risk when we go out there, when we get information, etc., and when we're in the front line. And finally, and most importantly, and I think really echoing Honorable DG's comments earlier, is that we really are a part of social agents, and so media really must partner with government and other role players to ensure that information is disseminated to its public effectively and people ultimately benefit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ntuli. Of course, due to my proximity, I have more insights into what you've just presented, and thank you so much for an amazing presentation. But just something Madame Kalando touched on, one of the challenges of communicating during a pandemic as opposed to peace times. She was just saying where your audiences are either panicked or anxious. Just give us a sense of South African audiences and how they have received all the COVID-19 messaging that has been coming out either from the World Health Organization or from government or from the SABC or disseminated by the SABC.
I think that, first of all, I must say that I think the government has been very, very proactive and created infographics that can be shared on the digital platforms that are quick and timeless, particularly after each delivery, either ministerial delivery or presidential delivery. That has been very, very well executed, which has made our job as the SABC much, much easier. Having said that, as I mentioned earlier, there's still a lot of misinformation out there. And so you have to assume that people are, especially because we are one of the countries that is highest active on social media, we are constantly receiving other messaging. So while that messages, though some of those messages were very well packaged and very good, we have other sources that are also just as interesting. And if we don't have ways in which we can ensure trust within the publics, it's very easy for that information to get lost, no matter how well packaged it is. So the role that we have had to play really in partnership with government is to really enforce some of those messages that have been shared from the onset, to ensure that once the minister speaks, information goes out, but then what happens thereafter? So we have programming, we have current affairs that has interviews, we've got programming on drama series that everybody is glued to, 10, 12 million people are watching on a daily basis. Let's get the messaging out there, and that's what we have been doing. And of course, as I mentioned, the partnerships have been central for really our message in ensuring that people buy into the safety measures that have to be adhered to, but also in making sure that they can somehow protect their livelihoods one way or the other.